workshop. I think the videos has changed quite a bit. My name is Olia, for those of you who don't know me. And I'm very happy to host this lecture by Katrina Sluis. Katrina is a curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery. She's also a senior lecturer at the South Bank University, where she's the founding co-director of the Center for the Study of Magnetic Image. She has training in arts, has a background in system administration, and is a devoted geek.
That's a very touching thing to say.
She's put on some fantastic shows in the Photographers Gallery, and I think I met her when she invited me for the Lull of Cats, Felines, Photography and the Web in 2012. She's also put on some shows that worked with Animated GIF, the culture of Animated GIF called 1987, the Animated GIF, Lialina and Dragan Espenschied's 1 Terabyte of Kilobyte Age, and James Bridle Seamless Transitions from 2015. If you're around Oxford Street and past the Photographers Gallery, there's a wall and there's always something on it. Go there and have a look. There's
Currently video game photography at the moment.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very happy to know. Very, very interesting always to work with you, and welcome. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Olga. Thanks everyone for coming this evening. In terms of the sort of overarching framework of the series Curating Machines, I'm using it as an opportunity to have a bit of a catharsis about my own position within a cultural institution and the way in which, as a digital curator, I'm moving between the cultural value of the net and the cultural value of the institution. And hopefully in this talk, I will begin to talk about where those two things cannibalize and feed off one another in interesting ways. So my talk is called Desperately Seeking Audience, Hypercuration and the 21st Century Museum. And I'm extremely sleep deprived with a sick daughter. So I'm going to read this because I wasn't sure I could ad-lib and make sense. So I will try and be as engaging as possible. So in February 2011, Google released Panda, the first of several new updates to its PageRank algorithm. The release aimed to discipline rogue webmasters and prevent sites with poor quality content from polluting Google's top search results. With it came the imposition of a new metric of evaluation, freshness. Those seeking credibility within Google's scopic regime were told to generate new and dynamic content that's engaging, entertaining, enlightening, and/or inspiring across all available media channels. Suddenly, fencing suppliers added blogs to their sites, spare parts dealers developed YouTube channels, and cafes started tweeting in an attempt to win in the game of online attention. Whilst webmasters had always embraced the internet trope, content is king, famously coined by Bill Gates in, I think, 1996, the concept of freshness introduced an important temporal element to search for the very first time. And obviously there's been many more updates to the PageRank algorithm, but this was quite a significant shift in the way data was valorized and circulated online. However, as even the most evangelistic thought leaders in digital marketing admitted, the creation of beautiful images, thrilling videos, insightful white papers, and astute blog posts was both time-consuming and expensive. Instead, curation, not creation, was posed as a tactical response to the demands of contemporary cultural hyperproduction. The selection, evaluation, and representation of pre-existing content would mitigate any gaps in the 24/7 content feed. Hypermodern curating for hypermodern times. Curation here is mobilized as an authentic creative act, a step up from mere aggregation because, as the Content Marketing Institute asserts, aggregation is algorithmic. Curation is hand-picked. The human element of curation is a huge source of its value. Content curation was therefore celebrated as the primary means to cement business power and position oneself as a tastemaker who can influence the flow of online traffic and secure audience engagement. And hypercuration actually is a trademark term by a company called Intelli something, I've just completely forgotten. They have produced an interface whereby you can seamlessly evaluate content from multiple platforms in terms of brands, and as the curator you can work out who are the key influencers, what is the most trending piece of content, and remove it into different channels in order to increase engagement across all your channels. And I think this is something I'm quite interested in thinking about today, the way in which curating here is a resolutely human act in an age of automated content flow, and there is this kind of hypercuration becomes a useful term, I think, to describe a condition in which the maintenance of a form of cultural authority grounded in aesthetic modernism in an age of cultural hyperproduction is paradoxically achieved by the logic of content marketing, and these sorts of ideas sort of feed back into the cultural institution in interesting ways. So whilst there is presently an ongoing semantic war being waged about the usage of the term curate, it is important to consider how curation has been both diffused and operationalized in computational culture. As a technical practice born in an analog world, curation has largely been freed from its role to look after, preserve, and order the objects in colonial institutions, stopping the flow of time. In recent years, we have seen how curation has become less about the presentation of collections and more about the staging of new forms and experiences using the raw material of art, according to Keynes and Birchall, becoming a form of artistic authorship in itself. Today, the terms curate, curating, and curation are used broadly in contemporary culture, associated with activities ranging from blogging to shopping. However, less attention has been given to the annexation of these terms by professionals in the field of digital marketing and data analytics, and the parallel infiltration of these discourses back into the museum as frameworks to understand audience, participation, and cultural value. And I don't know if many of you have worked in cultural institutions, but many people agree that in the kind of power hierarchies of a kind of post-digital institution, the marketing team is the new programming team. And this kind of causes all sorts of internal tensions, I think, around who has the right to engage, how that language is developed, and who's in charge of those relations. So traditionally, in cultural institutions, actually, the question of audience, whilst it is of interest to maybe the education team, the marketing team are the ones who are all about audience development, which is a really key thing in culture today. My aim, therefore, is to explore how the cannibalization of curating by digital marketing and the parallel mobilization of social media analytics by the museum represents a paradoxical form of cultural democratization. However, this democratic form is not centered on the idea of equality, but on quantification, a sheer enumeration of audience members, events, artifacts, information, and likes. And I thought it might be useful to pause here and think of the two most important contemporary curators. On the left, we have Maria Popova, the queen of content curation online, whose website brainpickings.org sort of became the gold standard of how you might want to curate the web. She describes brain pickings as her invention and labour of love, a human-powered discovery engine for interestingness. And here we have Hans-Ulrich Obrist, who also is also defined by cultural hyperproduction. He famously produces millions of conversations with artists, books, Instagram posts. He famously doesn't sleep and has someone who even answers his emails at night for him, but also is wrapped up in this notion of avant-gardism and ceaseless innovation, even as he is engaging with these technologies. So the content curating game has become particularly crucial for museums which, having spent millions of pounds digitising their collections from the 1990s onwards, are now wondering what to do with them. As Jane Finnis from Culture 24 observes, the online audience for culture has been elusive. A 2011 report from Hitwise, the web metrics arm of the multinational corporation Experian, revealed that a cross-section of the UK's 40 biggest museums, galleries and venues attracted less than 0.04% of the total UK domestic web traffic, or 5.71 million visits. This she noted represents the equivalent traffic in the same period to littlewoods.com, a minor online shopping retailer. In order to improve their attention share, institutions have been encouraged to embrace digital marketing metrics, search engine optimization techniques, and data-driven design. Major organizations have transformed their websites from information silos into dynamic publishing platforms, or destination websites, which is a term you hear a lot, to project their brand on a global stage. This approach chimes well with British policymakers, whose broadcast model of technological innovation sees the digital turn not in terms of a cultural shift, but as a technical one offering new tools to unlock audiences, new markets, and organisational resilience. But as writer Orit Gat notes, playing this kind of metrics game only serves to solidify and preserve the status of those institutions with the biggest brand reach, resources, and collections that can be deployed as content marketing. Up here we have the Walkers' very famous institutional website. They, a number of years ago, turned their website into a publishing machine. They saw the website not as a kind of marketing leaflet that tells you what's on where, but as a way of attracting an online audience to the institution. They're in Minneapolis. They don't have the same kind of audience available in their local community. So the web becomes a site through which visitors who might never be in the local area can still experience their program. Tate, for example, very famously calls their website the third Tate, fourth Tate, fifth Tate, one of the Tates, and has also invested heavily in publishing and have Tate Media. For those of us like the Photographers Gallery who don't have access to such resources to become a kind of publishing machine, we are embracing content curation, but we're calling it viewpoints on our website, in which we just recycle old content but give it a kind of fresh and sexy, kind of précis on the website. So in a way, this is the kind of paradox of hypercuration. And here we have a project that Culture 24 has done called Van Gogh Yourself, which they received funding from the European Union for the Europeana project, which was very much thinking, what do these digitized collections of Europe do? Who are they for, and how can we make use of them? I think they realized that the website for Europeana had basically no visitors, despite millions being invested in it. So then in the second phase, they did a lot of experimentation with different kinds of organizations about how this content can be unlocked, whether it be through TripAdvisor and reviews to get you to go to their institutions, but also how to engage with the collections. So in this project, which has won many awards and was on BBC Breakfast Television even, you have the opportunity to find a Creative Commons image from Europeana and reperform it and share it online. Another interesting, if we think about brand reach, Google's Cultural Institute, which was rebranded Google Art and Culture, had an app which not many people had installed on their phones until recently, and how many of you in the audience did this? That when it went viral, that you could send your face to the Google database and they would match you with an image from the Google Cultural Institute. This again was huge. Did anyone in this room do this? No?
Yeah, I heard about it because I remember that I was in Spain and there was the Museum Artico.
Yeah.
Salisa was one of the first 150 museums included in the Google Art project.
Yeah.
And that's how I found out about it.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Google Art Project too is they work with cultural institutions and they say, we are not the curators. You guys are. You are the ones with the knowledge. We will be guided by you. This is kind of a part of the organization which we don't need to make any money out of. But let us take our cameras into your institution and digitize everything. And we will give this away for free, and our platform will give you a gateway to a huge, huge audience. When you ask people from the Google Cultural Institute, do you give away the metadata that's generated from millions of people looking at the history of culture on your website away for free? And do you see this as a public cultural resource? You don't get the same sort of response. And interestingly, this app that went viral, people in Illinois were extremely upset that they couldn't participate and use the app because biometric law, data regulation in that state and another US state meant that the app wouldn't work. And Google states that none of people's portraits were stored after the match, but I think this quite interesting way in which the capture of data through these kinds of forms of participation is quite interesting, and also raises questions for cultural institutions who have very much, if I think about my own institution, photography has been a really important way, especially in this country, for engaging with marginalised people, giving them tools to represent themselves and a voice. But now we're in a situation where participation and expressing oneself is kind of hegemonic and is also being used, equally by brands as ways of getting your engagement as well. So we did a project where we partnered with The Guardian to get during our mass observation show to ask people to take photos of their mantelpiece, which is a famous directive from the Mass Observation Archive. And ultimately, this is exactly the kind of thing that other brands were doing at the time to increase engagement with their platform. And so it raised many questions for us about what the meaning of participation in ubiquitous social media might be for a cultural organisation. So in the UK, as in the United States and elsewhere, Google Analytics is emerging as the primary tool for understanding cultural audiences online. And the Arts Council actually partnered with Culture24 and Google itself to run workshops to cultural institutions to encourage them to install analytics on their website. And Culture24 also has run a series of action research projects with cultural institutions, getting them to experiment and find ways of exploring their collections. I spoke at one of these events and I was amazed to hear that people didn't realise you could actually game the system because obviously reporting of this data is becoming more and more important to defining value. So since Google Analytics launched in 2005, it's become the tool of choice for web marketers whose principal aim is to intensify visitor engagement for the purpose of generating commercial transactions. The analytics toolset caters directly to this user base supplying ready-made metrics to monitor web traffic, content experiments, AdWords campaigns, sales targets, and return on investment. Because the main function of Google software is to audit the efficiency of advertising in directing traffic to a website or converting visitors into customers, the product models the web as a world of billboards, shop windows, and checkouts. Within this paradigm, content becomes instrumentalized in the service of retaining eyeballs or appeasing Google's PageRank algorithm, which ensures only the freshest, most frequently websites get prioritized in search results. And it's worth noting that organizations, including Wikimedia and Der Spiegel, have taken the decision not to use Google Analytics for analyzing web traffic due to concerns about privacy and the fact that user data and their browsing patterns are hosted elsewhere. So it's quite interesting then these kind of questions of public cultural value and the tools that are being used within cultural organizations. There is absolutely no discussion around some of those questions or what digital public space might be and what the role of the institution might be. So there is a strange situation emerging where on the one hand, the cultural sector is asked to adopt the logic of digital marketing in order to become more participatory, audience-driven, and relevant in a time of reduced state and private funding. On the other hand, as I mentioned in my opening comments, the logic of digital marketing seeks to intensify brand value and shore up cultural value through the valorization of curation or content connoisseurship based on modernist authorship. It is no surprise then that infographics complete with paintbrush-wielding artistes advise us how to master the art of the curated post, whilst dashboards in the form of analytics canvases promise to make the vista of big data aesthetically intelligible. A vice president of IBM at a recent conference told the assembled group of chief information officers that they must think like art curators as they begin to build an infrastructure for a brave new world of, quote, analytics everywhere. She went on to say, art curators understand what art to portray to what audience. They also catalogue the history of artwork, label it appropriately, know who created that piece of art, who last held that piece of art, who enjoyed that status, that piece of art at different stages, and can estimate the value of that piece of art. This is a role I expect every Chief Information Officer, Chief Technical Officer, Data Officer, Chief Data Officer, and Data Steward to begin to embody. Meanwhile, the cultural sector is being told to think like data analysts. In a 2013 report by Nesta, Counting What Counts, What Big Data Can Do for the Cultural Sector, museums and galleries were chided for falling behind on data collection, in which the authors stated, "It is high time for a step change in the approach of arts and cultural bodies to data, and for them to take up and build on the management of so-called big data in other sectors. If museums and galleries, the argument goes, could only dig into their data, they could benefit from data-driven decision-making and achieve a culture of excellence marked by greater financial returns and a loyal, engaged audience." And I mean, all this kind of rhetoric is completely through this commissioned report. With the right analytical dashboards and appropriate metrics, future cultural managers will nurture a data-driven culture in which statistical and predictive modelling is used to gain insights on complex issues. Risk can be minimised, quality can be evidenced, and stakeholders can be assured that audiences are getting what they want, even as the definitions for risk, quality, and stakeholders flex to meet various ideologies. However, few of the data sets amassed by the sector could even technically qualify as big data. Instead of a data revolution, we're witnessing a mania of metrics in which new methods of measurement and audience modelling are being valorised and made operational. By extracting people, things, relationships, and transactions into numerical values, metrics provide a means through which cultural processes can be easily compared, monitored, and controlled. So at a time of reduced public spending and evidence-based public policy, metrics have become powerful rhetorical weapons. And interestingly, there still remains no universal agreement concerning which metrics constitute success. However, the most fetishized measurement remains footfall, both inside the museum and now online, where Facebook likes and Twitter followers are the new currency. And despite the spread of an audit regime tied to performance management and quality control, there remains an anxiety concerning the priorities and contributions of public museums and how they will secure and serve their future audiences. And the Arts Council actually require every national portfolio organisation who receives regular funding to actually, in their annual reports, report how many Twitter followers, how many Instagram followers, and how many Facebook followers you have, and the percentage increase year on year. Of course, they always go up, so I'm not sure what they hope to understand. But there is a kind of loss underpinning all this of how online engagement in culture might be measured and understood. So how might an organisation capture and measure something as complex and messy as engagement or cultural value? And historically, art's social and economic significance has been theorised within the domains of academia and policy making and separated from the actual practices of the museum. On the ground, cultural managers have relied on the blunt reporting of visitor figures, supplemented by surveys and focus groups to paint a qualitative picture of their institution's impact. But beyond these sporadic evaluations, there is little support, especially financially, for more expensive longitudinal research that using reflexive or democratic methodologies could offer a different modelling of engagement or social outcomes, particularly in the digital realm. So most of the kind of funding for culture and digital has really been about new ticketing apps, new methods of audience data, and not so much questions about wider issues to do with what this culture, how digital culture relates to the institution. So this is where social media and web analytics step in, offering a cheaper alternative, promising to unlock the mystery of audience behaviours over consistent periods of time and even real time. And so this logic is now migrating back into the museum, where iBeacons and other tracking devices are being piloted to capture audience behaviours within gallery buildings, which are now perceived as dangerous data black spots. With the accumulation, measurement and cross-correlation of enough data points, it is hoped the qualitative might ultimately be discovered in the quantitative. Or, as you may all know, the famous words of Wired editor Chris Anderson, with enough data, the numbers speak for themselves. So this is not to deny that web analytics have an important role in helping museums evaluate the effectiveness of their website strategy. But with the increasing pervasiveness of Google Analytics and its competitors, there is a danger that cultural participation risks being further operationalized in the service of branding. The possibilities of the web to offer dialogic encounters with an audience in which the digital is understood less as an instrument than as an epistemological shift demanding a new kind of porosity has largely been forgotten beyond a very limited flirtation with crowdsourced curation, which also has its own kind of problems. And while the use of web analytics is often celebrated as audience-centric and democratic, it nonetheless adopts a largely broadcast-oriented consumer welfare model of audience engagement, where cultural knowledge flows omnidirectionally from the institution to the individual. What remains, as researcher Leslie Langer observes, is a situation where terms like participation and engagement are both fetishized and used interchangeably to describe some activity or program wherein visitors were active and made a contribution, however small or large that might be. It's worth noting that Google defines engagement through a standard set of metrics, including bounce rate, pages per visit, and average visit duration. These are accessed through an analytics dashboard interface that conceals a complex backend of API calls and linguistic modeling. So just as footfall statistics have been denigrated for their wayward inclusion of toilet visitors and cafe patrons, Google's classification and sampling methods contain certain biases, Engagement is famously only measured when a visitor moves between pages, leaving someone who has been enwrapped for 10 minutes on a single page classified as a bouncer. And traffic reports must be guarded against inflation by spam and search engine bots. Because Google's metrics almost always require customization, and discerning insights from them quite complicated, there are actually now calls for data scientists to become embedded in larger cultural institutions. And I think the V&A and other institutions are now hiring people in that role. So those without such resources, it's possible to source bespoke metrics from an emerging cottage industry of analytics experts or enthusiasts who develop and trade custom dashboards carefully calibrated to produce their own specific modelling of engagement. So we're in a situation where we don't have a standardised universal set of metrics. However, I think I just showed you culture counts, and also museum analytics, which seek to kind of find ways to step in and aggregate and compare. So museum analytics, which no longer exists as of this morning. I think I couldn't find it anymore, or their website is down. MoMA, of course, has the most likes, but the Art People Gallery, you should probably check it out if you haven't seen it. And Culture Counts, which was a Nesta digital R&D fund project, trying to find ways of finding a massive analytics dashboard that would aggregate data from all cultural institutions in Britain so we could compare them all. And so Culture Counts is a platform for cultural measurement and the first system in the world to draw together comprehensive public value metrics with an electronically automated data collection platform in order to be used in more effective data-driven decision-making. So you can see all the new managerialism of British public culture being drawn into these kinds of discussions. So as media scholar Nate Chach has observed, the present proliferation of dashboards embodies a new form of governance characterised by distance and control, in which the data deluge is made intelligible through the presentation of aesthetically beautiful, actionable metrics. He notes that the origins of the dashboard can be found in the early 20th century, when a wooden board was used in a horse-drawn carriage to protect the driver from the mud and dirt generated in order to more closely focus on driving. With the invention of the automobile, gauges, warning lights and meters were added, which further separated the act of driving from the need to understand the workings of the engine itself. Later, dashboards were crucial in establishing a distinction between the factory floor and the corporate headquarter, where operations could be regulated through complex feedback systems. This act of separation is significant. Through the analytical window of the dashboard, the audience is further removed from the actual practices of the museum, reduced to a set of data points. It is a process that conforms to Deleuze's model of cybernetic control, in which corporate systems transforms individuals to individuals, and masses are envisaged as samples, data, and markets. As anyone who's anyone who's worked in a cultural organisation will know, audiences are often dismissed as an unruly mass. They don't read interpretation materials, they ignore signage, and occasionally spend more time taking selfies than actually consuming art. But online, through the use of analytics, it becomes possible to visualize and discipline a remote online audience and glean their desires, whilst reinforcing certain preferred behaviors, such as signing up to the newsletter, visiting the online shop, or sharing content through website optimization. So the dashboard generates a situation of perpetual feedback and enhancement, in which metrics are set and content can be shaped, evaluated, and further improved to secure the perpetual growth of audience, revenue, and brand visibility. There's also a tendency for cultural institutions to call themselves brands, not galleries now. The audience is here cast in the role of surveilled consumer rather than the empowered citizen, subject to the asymmetries of data collection. The present desire to make collections more accessible digitally is therefore closely linked to the way databases and digital archives are themselves being instrumentalized for the generation of information about their users and their social value. There is then a crucial tension between the idea of open and free access to culture and the desire of all public and private information providers to audit who their users are and how they act online. So this is actually a new stage in a much longer history of audience segmentation, a method used by cultural organisations to discern what their visitors' needs might be. In recent years, Tate has moved from a model based on established demographic categories of gender, age and race in favour of a set of visitor personas based on behaviours: aficionados, actualisers, sensualists, researchers, self-improvers, social spaces, sightseers and families. Arts Council England classifies the public into 13 segments according to degrees of cultural engagement, from the urban arts eclectic to the bedroom DJ and the time-poor dreamer. And they even offer a tool where you can have a quiz and discover what segment you're in. Crucially, the shift from demographics to lifestyle segments represents the abandonment of an older cultural politics of the Civic Museum, in which the missing audience was obstinately revealed through the demographics of class and ethnicity, highlighting the persistent failure of policies encouraging widening participation. This process of segmentation, which is closely aligned with the Consumer Museum, is built on consolidating existing audiences, not new ones, and has been highly successful in helping museums such as Tate thrive in the so-called experience economy. And this modelling ignores the absent audience and focuses instead on targeting those who do come without having to change or shift the object of cultural value itself, i.e. art. So the museum's turn to analytics also heralds the increasing datafication of audience, in which visitor data is prized as a strategic asset to be converted into new forms of value. And as I noted earlier, Nesta sees this as a necessary shift in mindset that will enable cultural institutions to move from, quote, a philosophy of dependence, subsidy and market failure, which underpins much of the cultural sector, in order to become value-driven. And while Nesta sees marketing and development as the logical first step of data-driven decision-making, their report suggests in the future it might be extended to artistic decision-making. So although the authors don't go as far to suggest that museums should become BuzzFeed-style metrics-driven content farms, there remains an underlying desire to control social and cultural processes revealed in the following statement from the report. We mentioned sentiment analysis earlier in the workshop, but these sorts of tools are giving glimpses of a future in which it will be increasingly possible to measure and influence the spread of ideas and the coming together of groups of people. So why shouldn't cultural organisations be in there? So in this way, the discourse of metrics sits at the intersection of the present euphoric climate of innovation and politics of privatisation. So sort of to wrap up, what might this datafication of audience mean in practice? The most celebrated example of big data in the arts is Dallas Museum of Art's DMA Friends, a membership scheme known as a digital platform for museum engagement. The project helps the museum connect with audience at scale by incentivising them to participate in a way which closely resembles customer loyalty programs used elsewhere. So they got rid of all their membership fees. Everyone who came to the museum became a member and signed up. And this free membership offers them benefits like parking discounts, exclusive events and free tickets. And crucially, as you can see in the photo at the top, opportunities are provided through the building for visitors to check in and participate in challenges to accrue membership points. So for example, you might get a special explorer badge if you went to the very end of the museum to the poorly visited Indigenous art section that is in the basement. And it sort of created a way to motivate people to move through the museum in a different way, and then you would be rewarded with enough points for maybe a private encounter with the collection with a curator or something like that. or free parking. And through this initiative, the museum was able to develop a huge market research platform, which generated over 21.8 million discrete fields of data annually. And whilst they were very careful to build up trust and only harvest data willingly offered by visitors, it was used to understand their behaviours in order to drive repeat visits and incentivize preferred forms of behaviour. And what have they done with this data? Well, the platform is now helping the museum to find corporate partnerships, much in the way Facebook might, by leveraging audience data and saying, well, our audience is from this demographic, this is how you would want to reach them and why you would want to work with us. So they have the same kind of extremely detailed information about those audience. So clearly, metrics remain powerful rhetorical tools to be strategically deployed in the development of institutional narratives of accountability and impact. However, it becomes crucial to ask, what is this narrative of accountability and who makes it? Is it a useful way of addressing future communities and their needs? Is there a danger that through these narratives, an audience of the future is reproduced as an audience of the present? In this respect, the challenge for museum and galleries is to see analytics not merely as a tool, but as a shift in how we perceive and value kinds of knowledge and public participation. The pressing issue is not what can big data do for the arts, but how the harvesting of data might challenge the dynamics of culture, social relationships, and the public realm. So from this position, it becomes possible to move away from a culture of analytics to an understanding of analytics as culture. And that is the end.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Katrina. Do you have questions?
Hi. I was just wondering to what extent you kind of felt there's a drive to make the museum a kind of flat space in the content, the cafe, the experience, the curator talk, the parking, are all of equal value in the context of either another platform, whether that be Instagram, Facebook, whatever, or actually, by the museum in itself as a kind of mall for consumption.
Sorry, do you mean in terms of like social media strategy, or do you mean
in
like
terms of how whether there's an equivalence between the curated selection of work and all of the other stuff that's going on in that sphere?
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not someone to defend, a kind of monastic embrace of the art object as the main way one should engage with the institution. And I think, part of this is my frustration that there are many opportunities presented by these tools, but we're in a situation where there is a lack of imagination, and these tools get ended up using to reinforce analog cultural value. I mean, if you look at Google Cultural Institute, for example, why, when you have the possibility to do something on the web with the history of art, you just reproduce the space and value and optics of analog culture there. And why, I mean, it's interesting even in terms of our Instagram feed for the Photographers Gallery. So for example, you would think this is a platform we would be on. If it of course is controlled by the marketing team, it wasn't being used apart from photographs of the cafe every now and then. We did a project where we asked the misfits of Instagram to take over the Instagram feed during our motherhood and photography show. We got pregnant breastfeeding yoga mum from Hawaii to take over and share her photos. She'd been banned off Instagram. Famously, we got a documentary photography in Iran to talk about the fertility crisis there. We got lots of people through the digital program using the Instagram feed who we would never show in the gallery. And it created an opportunity for us to have a 6-week conversation with an audience who would never step foot in the institution about some of the themes and questions that we were dealing with inside the building. And that, to me, seems like something crucial that can be done by an institution. However, what ends up happening is that the Instagram takeover then becomes the dominant model, and it's the usual suspects, and then there's the temptation for cultural institutions to say, I want to work with that photographer over there. They've got a following of 1 million followers, and if we give them a takeover, they're going to come and, you know, boost our metrics. So it becomes, you know, both the potential to flatten out and become more porous and be a networked institution, but all this question of value, brand, and also the need to kind of defend oneself to one's public funders becomes this kind of tension, I think.
I mean, it's something that you can comment on. I'm not sure it's a formulate the question, but for me it's interesting from the perspective of the avant-garde, obviously, you know, kind of thinking about the relationship between aesthetics and politics now, and what, you know, participation and engagement used to mean and what it means now, and how that somehow is, I don't know, I think like questions like that, you know, the question of the institution of data don't really come out necessarily in, you know, theoretical discussions of what art can do right now. But, you know, do you think that something like that changes our relationship and also what artists produce as well?
Yeah, I think, again, the question of the agency of the participatory project by the artist, with the institution, with the public, in an age of social media, and how that is even commissioned, definitely gets changed. And even the commissioning of art, you know, I mean, we've all heard about art that gets commissioned because it's Instagrammable. And also the way in which, yeah, I mean, the influence of Instagram on that is quite fascinating when you start to unpack all of that. But in terms of that question about collaboration and agency, I think there is a tendency to ignore the fact that these dynamics have changed and continue on business as usual. And I think that's also a problem, but also funders also want the same kind of model of collaboration. And it's very hard to find, like find funders who are interesting to do research projects that might put this at the heart of the problem. In the way the funding comes to you already with the kind of idea that we need a digital platform to solve this problem, or participation in the way it's been understood in analog culture hasn't changed, it's still doing good. Can you produce a program that will reach 8,000 school kids over 2 years? Here's £1 million, you know. So, yeah, I think I'm really interested in some of these questions, but I don't really know who to speak to about that. And I think the interesting problem that institutions also have is that digital teams sit in marketing, I sit in programming, Irene at the V&A does a really interesting program, she's in education, and those sorts of institutional frameworks also limit the way you can have discussions or move across. And of course digital cuts across education, programming, development. So I think it's a structural problem as well.
I have a question. I had a dark vision as you were talking about, especially this quote from Nesta. Yeah. It was actually quite sinister in some way.
Yeah.
You know, influence people. And of course culture influences
yes.
people. That's what it's supposed to.
Yes.
It's a different
yes.
kind of influence, right?
Yeah.
So I was just thinking, because in a way, if like you do a scheme of what you were talking about, you'd say that the cultural content is kind of frozen, or like there's kind of the tendency to preserve the forms as they were and not engage with revolutionizing the formats or forms of engagement, not opening up to the digital, kind of freezing this things that were throughout the 20th century attacked for being, ivory towers, preserves of the white and things like that. So it's like, because you have to, this is what you sell as a cultural institution. On the other hand, you have a flattening out of everything through the use of metrics that read everyone as a potential customer and moves everyone into the field of the customer. So you have, it's actually very dangerous if you think that, because culture is a political battlefield. So if you, on the one hand, try to completely freeze and kind of not allow it to grow and change, and on the other hand, kind of level out everything else, you just prepare a perfect infrastructure for fascism. It's like it's there. It's like you just then only need to put something different into this measure and then influence. And then it's there. It's like a virus. It's like the infrastructure is prepared. I don't know.
Yeah, I think. How do you respond to that? I think there is not enough sort of literacy around these tools by institutions, and constantly it's like this kind of endless, you are not innovative, you are not this, you need to go and work with some technologists on an amazing VR project, and somehow this will, mean that you become relevant to a new audiences. And I think there's definitely a question about engagement with different audiences that research we've done at South Bank shows. But this kind of annexation or bringing in young audiences into the institution, but then they go out again, like for a party on a Friday night late, but without the institution needing to change or engage, I think, and this kind of stasis is a very interesting kind of problem. So the digital can be let in as long as it doesn't transform the institution, or it can be let in as a broadcast medium or as a tool for communications, as you see from the kind of analytics kind of discourse. But this whole thing about data-driven decision-making and cultural programming, it's kind of there in the report, but it never quite goes there. And I've sat in meetings where the head of the Arts Council has said, you know what, you're not competing with the gallery down the road, you're competing with the cinema down the road. So, yeah.
Well, at least not Primark, or maybe you are.
But it is that kind of sense of like, where is the audience of the future? They're all over here. Why are you not? You need to go there. But the best way to do this is by partnering with a brand and doing this or whatever. Yeah.
I was still thinking about the Cultural Institute and Google Art project, because as far as I remember, Google Art project also allows you to save the pieces that you kept.
Curate your own, yeah.
And sort of curate your own collection.
Mm-hmm.
So it made me wonder, because when it was the project that showed on the slide, where you could get the similar face with the artwork, of course it's that would not store data for privacy reasons. But I was wondering what they would do with those data of people picking collections, because of course it could be pretty good indicators of what type of content people are engaging with.
Well, this is something that we were talking about this morning too, in terms of service, and Jessica Raymond's done a great piece of research looking at terms of service policies in which specifically people like Google, Facebook, whatever, will say, okay, you own the copyright to what you upload, but we own any metadata, because metadata is a kind of authorless byproduct of your engagement with the platform, and it specifically talks about any of that additional data that you create as being authorless, as a kind of neutral waste that they just hoover up. And I think, you know, that is extremely interesting. I mean, this is something that Getty Images also understands by giving its images away for free, as long as you use their special plugin, because they realize metadata about use of images is far more valuable than their stock images of cats. So.
And do you think that there's like some potential in the future for Google to take over a little bit in the curation? Because, like, for example, now.
Well, off the record, I've had a discussion with someone who said that, yeah, we realise we are actually curators. Like, they are admitting that they are.
Because, like, I was wondering about, like, the program of Artists in Residence.
Yes.
And also by picking the already 150, you start wondering according to which criteria you pick it.
Yeah. I mean, since then they've now expanded massively into commissioning and working with cultural institutions. So yeah, definitely. First it was just hoover up as many collections as possible, and now it's very much about generating content for Cardboard or whatever platform.
I used to work in television.
So you know.
Of course, in cultural television.
Yeah.
But all this audience metrics stuff is totally familiar down to the name Anthony Lilly on the Nesta report. I mean, what he's doing is transposing what is happening in television in terms of the segmentation of the market and his use of these kind of classifications of different types of engagement.
Yeah.
I mean, that's very much what's happening from the mid-90s, particularly in the BBC. But the difference is, I mean, the great thing is you said there are no standard metrics yet. You didn't say yet, but you should have said that. Because the problem with television was there was a moment when the metrics got standardized.
Yeah.
So long as you've got one set of figures which support your argument to go against the other set of figures, then you're in a much stronger position. Yeah. And especially as Dogbert said, will your data be accurate? Well, just pay the bots. Visit your website and you'll be fine. So that's a whole fictional game played with public funding institutions, which, as we know from universities and all the rest of it, are absolutely obsessed with measuring value for money.
And also this question of comparing.
Yes,
radically different institutions.
Well, but that's what you have a network for, is to say, let's kind of get them collectively. Yeah,
and I mean there are even the kind of language of KPIs and balanced scorecards are also being, inside cultural institution used, and the spreadsheet. You don't have the curator now; you have the spreadsheet with risk and all the different aspects around shows.
So there was that side of your presentation, which is about the metrics, and the other side was actually about what the web experience of a museum collection might be, which is much more difficult kind of thing to discuss, because in a way, a kind of sensorium of the web, if you like, is precisely the same sensorium as the museum, which is a see and don't touch kind of thing. See and don't touch, move from one thing to another, in some kind of spatial or quasi-spatial relationship. And that seems to me where a lot of the kind of classic institutions do have a real problem in relation to the web. That actually it can drain from the experience of the physical and the experience of presence without anybody knowing.
I think, and also who these collections are for and how they're understood. We did a project where we asked 100 South Bank University students to answer the question, what is the Britain in Tate Britain, and go to a Tate Britain exhibition. We did collaborative research where migrant and diasporic families were co-researchers looking at the collection there, and they were asked to produce their own work in response to the collection. So we had a day at Tate done Nollywood style, where the security guard falls in love with the white curator, and other sorts of forms of responses to the collection, or what these young people felt was absent from the British collection. And I think it was very telling, and it was actually very controversial inside the Tate, actually, around letting people kind of critique the collection in that way. And I think this is what I mean about cultural values flowing outwards from the institution to the audience. And the digital just becomes another channel for that, rather than a more dialogic experience, I think.
Are there, or where are resistances to metrics, culture, metrics domination coming from?
That's a good question.
The art world or museum world?
Artists, of course. So the great project, Constant Dallart's project, where he bought 1 million Instagram followers on eBay, and redistributed them to unknown net artists and Hans Ulrich Obrist and others as a form of digital communism. Completely ruined the metrics for some cultural institutions. He ruined Amalia Ullmann's work at the time, apparently, because she was very invested in how many followers she had for her artwork. And I think that was quite interesting, because, when that work came out, no one I knew of, in Arts Council, realised that you could buy followers online in this way. And so there are sorts of artists who are trying to kind of begin to unpack that, I think. In terms of cultural institutions, I think they're just happy to just do what the Arts Council says and survive at the moment.
But I think the kind of narratives that are produced because I was recently in Romania, and there was someone from an institution there, and they were talking about how they're using the data to convince the government to invest in art by basically showing how, if you have young people working with art and being close to culture and being close to art, they have something like 5 times more chances of not ending up in prison. So they save tax money by giving money to culture. Yeah. And for me, just the idea that a narrative like this is built in relation to art and culture at all. Yeah. It's just something that I just can't really accept, but
there is an argument for critical reading that recently read a paper by a woman who was arguing for that you can gain and argue for visibility through data, and through the case of this forcibly disappeared women in Mexico. There's a city where over the last, I don't remember now the name, maybe you know it, it's quite an international scandal, thousands of women keep disappearing, and there are no numbers, and there is no statistics, and there is no data, and you cannot make a claim, and you cannot take it to court. So it is not negative, and we should fight it. There is also, and that's also what James was saying, we should fight against maybe standardization or dominance of something, but in itself, it doesn't necessarily have any negative essential utility. You can also
I think it's not the data itself, or even the systems of measurement. It's more that an institution that supposedly supports artists and culture will use that data to convince the government that they're saving money. And I know it's not something that they believe in, but they're forced to create narratives that will then force the government to participate. Yeah,
you're always dealing in narratives when you're dealing with data like that, and it's just how clever you are at weaponizing the data, I think. And that requires skills in cultural managers to negotiate some of these questions. But I think this whole thing about this is like software as being some neutral excuse me, tool for the institution. And I think there needs to be a much more critical awareness of where these values are coming from. Thanks.
There is also something to do with speed, like
Oh yeah.
suddenly Google Analytics comes with like the full equipment. You have like every parameter is like measurable with endless upgraded features and so on. Whereas if you say, well, let's think about it, you know, like it takes so much time to produce something that sort of would be convincing and delivering some sort of interesting metrics. And so it's a double problem. It's the problem to figuring out what is your relationship to metrics, what kind of what could it bring outside of these constraints, but also it's like it's already there and you're always having to fight against something that is already implemented, already proves its own efficacy, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
I think I can see how that's really hard to challenge.
Yeah, and I mean ultimately policymakers are only responding to what they know the government will understand. So there is, the whole context of new managerialism and how do you, they're just trying to get culture to sort of answer these questions in a way that business people will understand.
And I'm just thinking about everything that's happened with GDPR regulations and kind of, is there like an endpoint to this where there's like a rejection of data-driven curating? Or I don't know what's going to happen in 20 years' time. I don't know.
Yeah, I was wondering about that as well.
You want a case against Facebook, and you have to have great legal power, but it's possible, I think. It's possible to argue that something has been done, that something that has been built in a private enterprise de facto became a public space. It needs to be regulated, and it has precedents, for this kind of legal decision making. So
It just comes down to how much you can afford the legal powers.
or how much political power can they get us to be like the European Union rather than maybe one country.
But I think the institution is has so much cognitive dissonance. So, on the top floor of the Photographers Gallery, we can be showing Trevor Paglen's Autonomy Cube, which is a tool router that anonymizes all data. And down in the cafe, we have a public Wi-Fi point that gets you to submit your social media credentials, which then produces a heat map of where everyone is sitting in the cafe and a huge analytics dashboard. I mean, this is the kind of... I'm sitting in meetings going... but you can't have those conversations.
Someone had a question on that?
It's not a question, but just kind of connect to what we were talking about this afternoon at the workshop about how the classifications of the past are coming back. And I was looking, everybody was kind of laughing at the psychographic segmentation that was there. Of course, in marketing that died like 2 decades ago, right? And so recently it came back with the Cambridge Analytica. And that's pretty strange that this is back and so powerfully there, because in corporate marketing, as I said, it's like at least 2 decades ago it's been criticized and done away with and proven completely and utterly ineffective and been moved on. And when I, for example, teach consumer behavior, I always say this was in the past heyday of the this lifestyle segmentation is 80s, 90s, and then we moved to the cultural segmentation. But it's of course impossible to do with the big data, So it's kind of interesting. We were talking about how this afternoon how we were just
then why is it the cultural organizations are spending so much money getting like lifestyle segments made for them?
Because this is the easiest thing to do with data. The sociocultural ones require you to go and talk to people and all messy stuff that costs a lot of money, basically. So we want something cheap and quick.
that creates nice
I
slides.
think. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'm just speculating.
Yeah.
But that's the same sort of we go back to this without critique, actually. Or I mean, there's been decades of critique, and we just. I think
Why is it not possible to have the conversation about what's happening at the top of the gallery and what's happening in the cafe space? Because that seems to me to be, well, that seems to me to be absolutely relevant to exactly all these controversies about the uses in how data is harvested and the uses to which it's put. So why is it not?
This is the separation of programming and operations.
Yes, but as an
in this
institution,
institution.
if you want, I mean, as an institution, if you want to have an impact, the impact, you know, the kind of components of impact are there in that juxtaposition.
I think the answer is in the erosion of the public realm and the traditional relationship between the museum as a civic space. And I think it's very much because...
But that's a negative answer. Why is it possible institutionally to say to the institution, what we have here is the answer that everybody's looking for. It's an experience. It's an experience which will bring it home to people, actually, what their data is, how they shed data as they move around, and how they could defend themselves against it, or at least know what it is that they are producing for other people.
Yeah.
So why
I'm glad you asked that
conversation?
question.
Because the marketing would love to have that conversation, wouldn't it?
Keep tuned. We're doing a show called All I Know Is What's on the internet about some of these questions. So
yeah. So it is possible to have that conversation.
yes.
Okay. So you're not being as negative as
no, but I think it is. It won't be with the same people. So it's like, but I think these institutional. I think what's amazing is, you know, the relationship between theory and practice and how these things are really tested on the ground in kind of practice and public cultural institutions, which is why I really wanted to sort of talk a bit about that today.
Right. Thank you very much, Katrina.
Thank you. Thanks for me.